Artie Bucco did not get robbed because he met a slick con artist. Artie got robbed because he believed the universe rewards confidence when it is wearing a nice jacket. Here is the hidden trap he never saw coming. The moment Artie borrowed 50 grand at 1.5% weekly from Tony Soprano, the story was over. Not dramatically, not symbolically, mathematically. 2 weeks later, he would owe $51,500 just to break even, before he even touched $1 of profit. And that is assuming the money actually comes back, which is adorable. Artie's genius plan was to loan the same 50 grand to Jean-Philippe and collect $57,500 in 2 weeks. He pictured himself pocketing a clean $6,000 like he had just outsmarted capitalism. What he did not picture was the part where Jean-Philippe stops answering the phone, rebrands the loan as an investment, and suddenly, Artie is chasing ghosts with a chef's ego and no leverage. And when Tony finally fixes it, it gets worse. Because Tony does not fix Artie's problem. Tony trades it. The debt disappears. And so does Tony's $6,000 tab at Vesuvio. Artie does not lose money because he is unlucky. He loses money because the universe hates delusion and loves receipts. So if this ever looked like a quirky side story, it is not. It is a case study in how a civilian tries to cosplay gangster economics and gets billed for the costume. Artie Bucco's little financial adventure with Jean-Philippe is often treated like a quirky side plot, a brief detour from the real business. In reality, it is one of the cleaner demonstrations of how the series punishes self-delusion with arithmetic. The numbers are not incidental. They are the point. A man tries to taste the glamour of easy money, misreads every risk signal in his own kitchen, and winds up losing precisely what he daydreamed he would gain. An outcome so neat, it feels less like coincidence and more like the universe doing editorial work. Start with the plan. A word doing heroic labor here. Tony fronts Artie $50,000 at 1.5% weekly interest. Because nothing says trusted childhood friend like a rate designed to keep a borrower jogging in place forever. Artie then intends to loan that same $50,000 to Jean-Philippe and get back $57,500 in 2 weeks. The genius margin is clear. Pay Tony $51,500, principal plus 2 weeks of interest, pocket the remaining $6,000, and walk around the dining room with the posture of a man who believes he has discovered commerce. The intended profit is not some sprawling fortune. It is a modest envelope that nonetheless carries the intoxicating promise of being a player instead of a restaurateur with invoices, payroll, and a spouse who understands math. Then the series does what it loves. It lets the fantasy run just long enough for the hangover to land. After the suicide attempt and the hospital fallout, Tony steps in with a benefactor's flourish. He will take care of the Jean-Philippe debt, and, as part of the same magnanimous gesture, wipe his own tab at Vesuvio. Artie states that tab is $6,000, which means the grand scheme ends with Artie losing $6,000 while trying to make $6,000. Symmetry this perfect is not a random flourish. It is a thesis. The entire escapade resolves into a moral equation. The restaurant owner was out of depth, and the bill arrives in the exact denomination of his arrogance. The most biting detail is that Artie's loss is not merely financial. The $6,000 is the price of believing proximity to gangster wealth grants competence in gangster mechanics. Artie does not simply want money. He wants the feeling that money in that world supposedly buys: status, sexual access, authority, the ability to make other people move around the room. He wants to make moves, as though entrepreneurship is mostly posture and a short-term note. The show makes sure the audience sees how little of this is about prudent investing. It is about self-image. A working stiff surrounded by men who treat predation like a profession starts to imagine he can borrow the costume without inheriting the consequences. Charmaine's role in this is not subtle. She is the adult in the room, which makes her unpopular, which is usually how adulthood goes. Her insistence on keeping Artie financially distant from Tony's world is framed as nagging only if one mistakes restraint for cowardice. The moment Artie crosses that boundary, he demonstrates precisely why she drew it. It is not that she fears the mobsters as characters. She fears them as a system. The system does not require personal malice to do damage. It simply requires someone like Artie, proud, restless, flattered by attention, to imagine that friendship immunizes him against predatory incentives. The comparison to Davy Scatino makes this explicit. Davy owed Tony less than Artie owed Tony, and it still ended in ruin. Business busted out, life dismantled, dignity liquidated. The difference is not that Tony becomes merciful in one case and savage in the other out of pure sentimentality. The difference is that Artie remains, barely, on the correct side of a line Tony is willing to acknowledge. Artie is framed as Tony's only real friend, the one civilian who can throw salami, talk back, and survive. Davy is an acquaintance wearing nostalgia as camouflage, a customer who walked into an executive game and unknowingly signed up for a demolition. The show's cruelty is that both men began as old friends, but debt converts friendship into inventory. Even so, the notion that Tony would never hurt Artie deserves the polite skepticism it earns. Tony might not ruin Artie with the same relish used on a gambler who cannot pay, but Tony still extracts value from Artie's weakness. Clearing the tab is not charity. It is profit-taking disguised as absolution. Tony wipes his $6,000 restaurant debt while assuming a $50,000 receivable from Jean-Philippe, then sends Furio to collect anyway, because benevolence in that orbit is simply violence with a clean suit. If Jean-Philippe pays, which the narrative strongly implies he will, given Furio's visit, Tony ends up whole and then some, while Artie ends up chastened and poorer. That is the friendship arrangement. Tony can afford to spare Artie the full bust-out experience because Tony can still win the exchange. The timing reinforces how transactional even Tony's tenderness can be. Tony's decision to step in happens at an emotionally convenient moment, when guilt is loud, when self-image requires evidence that he is not, in his own phrasing, a toxic person. The result reads less like moral awakening and more like narrative opportunism. Tony chooses the version of the outcome that repairs his conscience, without sacrificing leverage. At a different point in his life, less reflective, more irritated, more pressed, this could easily have ended with Artie's business being helped into the ground. That it does not is not proof of Tony's virtue. It is proof that Tony's mood matters as much as the debtor's balance sheet. Ralph Cifaretto's refusal to loan Artie the money becomes a rare moment of clarity from a man otherwise allergic to restraint. Ralph is a psychopath, but not a stupid one. He understands the obvious. Collecting from Tony's best friend is not a revenue opportunity. It is an invitation to get killed while holding a ledger. Ralph calculates that the money is not worth the conflict, and that pissing off Tony guarantees exactly zero profit. This is the amusing irony of the gangster ecosystem. The most unstable personalities still obey a rational rule when the boss's sentimental attachments are in play. In that sense, Ralph turning Artie down is not kindness, it is competence. It may also be the only decision Ralph makes that improves another person's odds of survival. This competence is part of why Ralph becomes a lingering indictment of Tony as a boss. Ralph is portrayed as a top earner, respected by his crew, productive in the only language that organization truly cares about, cash. Tony kills him anyway over a mix of personal rage, women, violence, pride, and the symbolic outrage of a horse. The show positions Ralph and Tony Blundetto as demonstrations of Tony's shortcomings. He cannot consistently separate leadership from impulse, cannot tolerate people who expose his insecurity, and cannot resist turning management into vengeance. In a rational criminal enterprise, an asset like Ralph would be managed, not eliminated. In Tony's enterprise, the boss is also the main volatility index. Back at Vesuvio, the scam itself matters less than Artie's inability to understand what he is actually doing. The French Armagnac pitch begins as a short-term borrowing request, and then morphs, once repayment becomes inconvenient, into the claim that the money was an investment, and therefore simply disappeared into market misfortune. That bait and switch is the entire con. Deny the existence of a loan by rebranding it as shared risk after the cash has changed hands. Even if the underlying business venture were real, the refusal to treat the money as debt is the giveaway. Loans do not magically become equity because the borrower feels embarrassed. The story drops small signals that the operation is rotten. There is the message machine broken flourish, an old-fashioned way of saying a con artist is suddenly unreachable. There is the dinner table moment where supposed novelty is exposed as old, implying that the product story is padded with theatrics. And there is the simplest tell of all, Jean-Philippe's confidence that Artie cannot enforce repayment. Con artists do not select victims at random. They select for compliance, confusion, and shame. Artie provides all three. He meets at his restaurant. He sneaks around his own spouse to hand over money. He advertises his insecurity with every furtive gesture. He effectively announces, "Here is a sum I cannot afford to lose, and here is my complete inability to pursue you if you take it." The debate over whether it was planned from the start or evolved opportunistically is almost beside the point. The more interesting interpretation is that the situation began as something plausibly legitimate, or at least plausibly deniable, and then shifted the moment Jean-Philippe realized what he had in front of him, an eager rube wearing borrowed confidence. Opportunism does not require premeditation. It requires a mark who makes theft feel safe. Yet the series also leaves room for a harsher conclusion. It was always a scam, and Artie was always the target. Either way, the outcome is the same, because the enforcement mechanism is absent. Artie extends credit without collateral, without contract, without a credible threat. In that world, that is not lending. It is donating with extra steps. And this is where the show's technical vocabulary quietly becomes thematic. VIG, weekly interest, compounding, and the logic of permanent indebtedness. A 1.5% weekly rate is not reasonable. It is a treadmill. Missed payments and the interest attaches to principal. The borrower's obligation expands by design. This is the foundation of the loan sharking business model. Create a structure where repayment of principal is theoretically possible but practically elusive, while interest payments become a perpetual annuity. The show even spells out the philosophy elsewhere, credit cards as metaphor, debt as lifestyle, and then uses Artie to demonstrate how quickly the fantasy of earning points becomes the reality of pay me. The hypocrisy is not subtle. Tony, who treats missed payments as personal insult, becomes remarkably delicate when he owes Hesh money. Suddenly, the man who lives on other people's late fees wants patience, deference, and moral credit for not committing theft. The storyline is a reminder that Tony's moral framework is not situational, it is self-serving. He can destroy a childhood acquaintance over a card game, then sulk like an injured child when asked to repay a debt to a mentor. This is not complexity. It is entitlement with therapy vocabulary. The restaurant subplot around Benny adds an additional layer of irony. Even Artie's honest business is being siphoned by the very world he envies. Tony sends Benny over with cash at one point, but that cash is implicated in a broader scam, credit card fraud run through Vesuvio, which results in the loss of American Express and the humiliation of promotional specials. This is the series in microcosm. The gangster world does not merely offer illicit opportunity, it colonizes legitimate enterprise. Artie ends up forced into discount tactics not because his food worsens, but because his proximity to predation damages his operating reality. When Artie later remarks from the deck of Tony's boat that hard, honest work does not pay off, it is less a complaint than a diagnosis, spoken by a man who has watched dishonesty repeatedly win and still cannot stop longing for it. Even the argument over Tony's tab becomes a character study in denial. Artie cites $6,000 at one point, but later appears to complain that Tony does not pay, implying a much larger and more corrosive pattern. Accounting-minded observers can do the mental math. A busy Italian fine dining restaurant, a group of men who rarely eat alone, generous ordering habits, marked up wine, frequent visits, and occasional larger events can plausibly pile up significant sums over time. A tab that feels impossible to the proprietor may be entirely believable on the consumption side, especially when dinner includes multiple courses and expensive bottles marked up several 100%, which is standard restaurant economics. The question is not whether the bill could accumulate, it is whether Artie's relationship with Tony allows him to treat it as enforceable. Complaining that Tony both eats without paying and takes parties elsewhere sounds contradictory only if one assumes normal customer dynamics. But Tony is not a customer, he is a force. Hosting Tony costs money. Not hosting Tony also costs money. That is the privilege of doing business in the shadow of coercion. The series also uses Artie's conduct to illustrate the psychological seduction of adjacent power. He performs a kind of mobster cosplay while remaining fundamentally civilian. He wants to be seen as bold, decisive, sexually magnetic, and financially clever. The flirtation with Elodie is part of the same fantasy. The money is a means to access a different identity, one that can command attention rather than earn it plate by plate. But the show refuses to let that fantasy be harmless. In the criminal ecosystem, money is not only currency, it is governance. Artie borrows the money, and with it, borrows the governance he does not understand. The most brutal elegance is that Artie's brush with the mob world does not even grant him the clean satisfaction of revenge. The audience is not shown Furio's collection in detail, which is itself telling. Violence in this series is often explicit, but here it happens off-screen, as though the mechanics are too routine to merit spectacle. Furio's presence is enough. The debt will be collected because collection is what the organization does best. The show does not need to show broken bones to convey inevitability. It only needs to show the ponytail on the doorstep. The missing scene becomes a statement. What happens next is procedural. And so the episode lands where it began, at Vesuvio, the place Artie actually owns. The place he built with work rather than intimidation. The place he repeatedly endangers by trying to borrow someone else's mythology. The $6,000 tab is not simply money lost. It is a symbolic confiscation of Artie's illusion that he can play at gangster economics without becoming collateral. Charmaine's opposition is vindicated not because she is joyless, but because she understands that friendship in Tony's world is rarely free. Tony may spare Artie the full Davy Scatino treatment, but only because Artie is useful as a mirror, proof that Tony can still be the generous boy from the neighborhood when it suits him. Artie's reward for trying to become a shark is to discover he is still prey, only now with a smaller bank account and a much clearer sense of where the waterline actually is. Power always eats the tab. Subscribe.